It's a Tuesday morning. You wake up, grab your phone, and the first notification you see stops your heart. Power grid failure across 14 states. Cause unknown. You shrug it off. Probably a storm. You make coffee. Except the coffee maker doesn't work. You try the lights. Nothing. You look outside. Your neighbors are in the street, confused. Someone down the block is already loading groceries into a cooler from their freezer. By noon, the grocery stores are locked. By evening, gas stations have lines wrapping around the block. By midnight, there are gunshots 3 streets over. This isn't a movie. This isn't a novel. This is what the opening week of a second American Civil War could look like, and here's the part that should terrify you. It would not announce itself. It would just begin. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how it could happen, what form it would take, and why it looks nothing like what you've seen in the history books. Most Americans, when they hear Civil War, picture Gettysburg. They picture 2 armies in open fields, blue versus gray, clear front lines, a geographic divide you could draw on a map. That world is gone. In 1861, the divide was simple to locate. North versus south. The Mason-Dixon line. You knew which side of the line you lived on. In 2025, the divide runs through your neighborhood, through your family, through your office. Political scientist Barbara Walter, who spent her career advising the CIA on how civil wars start around the world, puts it plainly: modern civil wars don't look like the last one. They look like insurgencies. Decentralized, asymmetric. They don't begin with a declaration. They begin with an incident that nobody stops in time. And here is the data point that should keep you up at night. The United States currently has more civilian-owned firearms than any country on Earth, an estimated 434 million guns in civilian hands. That is more guns than people, more guns than Canada has citizens. And those weapons are distributed across every city, suburb, and rural county in the country, on both sides of every ideological divide. There are no front lines in a war like that. There is no safe side of the map to move to. This is the first thing you need to understand. A second American Civil War would not look like the first one. It would look like something we've never seen before, and something we are dangerously unprepared for. Political scientists have a term for what happens right before a democracy slides into civil conflict.
They call it anocracy, a government that is partially democratic but with eroding norms and weakening institutions. And according to the same model the CIA uses to assess instability risk in foreign nations.
The United States currently qualifies. We'll get into what that means for you in a moment. But first, let's talk about how it actually starts. No civil war in modern history began because people simply decided to have one. They begin with a trigger, a single event that snaps a tension that has been building for years. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand didn't cause World War I, but it was the match that lit a powder keg that was already overflowing. What are America's powder kegs in 2025? The first is a contested election. America has already seen what a disputed election can do. January 6, 2021 was not a civil war, but it was a preview of what organized political violence on American soil looks like when a significant portion of the population believes the system has failed them. A disputed 2028 presidential election, with both sides armed, organized, and convinced the other side is destroying the country, could produce something far worse. The second trigger is economic collapse. Financial analyst Ray Dalio, who manages the world's largest hedge fund, has publicly estimated a 35 to 40% chance of civil conflict in the United States, pointing to what he calls Stage 5 indicators: states actively defying federal authority, large-scale migration to ideologically aligned communities, and rising incidents of political violence. The Gini coefficient, the standard measure of economic inequality, hit 41 in 2024. The highest since the Gilded Age. When enough people feel the system is rigged against them and they have nothing left to lose, political violence stops being unthinkable. The third trigger is foreign interference. Russia and China are not sitting on the sidelines watching America's divisions grow. They are actively investing in them. Russian disinformation operations in 2016, documented by the Senate Intelligence Committee, spent millions amplifying the most divisive content on American social media. A targeted foreign cyber attack during a moment of domestic crisis could be the invisible hand that pushes a volatile situation past the point of no return. The triggers are real. The conditions are present. The question isn't whether they exist, it's which one hits first. Let's get specific, because this is where most conversations about civil war go vague, and vague doesn't help you understand anything. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, one of the most respected national security think tanks in Washington, has modeled 4 distinct ways a modern American conflict could unfold. Here they are. This is the most likely scenario, and it's the most insidious because it never quite feels like war until it does. No armies, no battles. Instead, imagine a sustained campaign of targeted violence. Bombings at government buildings in swing state cities like Phoenix and Atlanta. Not enough to collapse the city, but enough to make every federal employee afraid to come to work. Assassinations of local judges, election officials, and community activists, not hundreds at once, but a steady drip of 10, 20, 30 a year, enough to make anyone in a position of civic authority wonder if they're next. This is what Northern Ireland's troubles looked like for 3 decades. Over 3,500 people dead. Life technically continued. Shops opened. Schools ran. But fear saturated everything. In an American version, the U.S. military, 2 million active personnel, the most powerful fighting force in history, could crush any organized military force. But you can't bomb an ideology. You can't airstrike a network of 200 people in 6 different states who have never met in person and coordinate entirely through encrypted apps. And here's the complication. A 2025 foreign policy analysis estimates that up to 30% of U.S. military officers hold views sympathetic to at least one insurgent faction. Veterans, trained, armed, and in many cases deeply alienated, would be recruited by both sides. Some would form what analysts call patriot brigades. Others, urban resistance cells. The conflict doesn't end. It just becomes the background noise of American life. This scenario exploits the most fundamental geographic tension in modern America. The fact that urban and rural populations are economically dependent on each other, but politically despise each other. 80% of Americans live in cities. Those cities rely entirely on rural regions for food, water, and energy. The Midwest produces 60% of America's grain. Texas controls 40% of domestic oil reserves. Rural factions, armed, self-sufficient, and with significant infrastructure leverage, could impose blockades without firing a single shot. Picture this. Grain shipments to New York and Los Angeles halt, not because of a military action, but because farmers simply stop sending them, and local militias enforce that decision. Food prices triple in urban grocery stores within 2 weeks. Within a month, shelves are empty. Within 2 months, cities that cannot feed themselves begin to fracture from the inside. Meanwhile, in rural areas, drone technology, already widely available for agricultural use, gets repurposed. Surveillance drones patrol field perimeters. More aggressive actors use incendiary drones to ignite wildfires that push into suburban borders. 2 million Americans flee to Canada or Mexico in the first year. Hyperinflation reaches 50%. The cities that built America's cultural and economic identity become ungovernable. By 2025, over 20 states have passed Second Amendment sanctuary laws, legislation that explicitly says state law enforcement will not enforce certain federal gun regulations. That is not a hypothetical. That is already happening. Extend that logic further, What happens when a state decides not just to ignore a federal gun law, but to ignore a federal election certification, or a federal immigration order, or a federal court ruling? California deploys its National Guard to resist federal agents. Texas mobilizes its own. Regional alliances form, a Pacific Federation anchored by tech money and AI-driven surveillance versus a Heartland Confederation controlling oil and agriculture. The U.S. military, split along the same ideological lines as the country, begins to fracture. This is the scenario that most closely resembles Yugoslavia's collapse in the 1990s, a multi-ethnic nation held together by institutional inertia that, once those institutions stopped being respected, disintegrated shockingly fast. Yugoslavia did not expect to be Yugoslavia. Neither does anyone else. Foreign powers move in to exploit the vacuum. Russia runs arms through Mexico to faction-aligned groups in border states. China executes cyber operations that accelerate economic collapse and, under cover of American chaos, moves on Taiwan. 15,000 dead in year one. A nationwide GDP collapse of 15%, and no clear path back to a unified federal government. This is the scenario most people don't take seriously, because nobody dies on camera. In 2021, a single ransomware attack on the Colonial Pipeline shut down fuel supplies across the eastern seaboard for nearly a week. Panic buying emptied gas stations from Georgia to New Jersey. That was one pipeline. One attack. Now imagine a coordinated domestic or foreign operation targeting the power grid across 14 states simultaneously. Hospitals running on backup generators that run out of fuel within 72 hours. Water treatment plants going offline. Financial networks freezing. The stock market crashing 20% in the first week as investors flee. Deepfake propaganda, already sophisticated enough to be nearly undetectable, fabricates atrocities and floods social media, turning neighbors against each other based on events that never happened. States wage economic warfare. California boycotts Texas oil. Texas halts natural gas exports to California, where 40% of power depends on external sources. The dollar loses 30% of its value. Supply chains, already fragile after 2020, collapse. And the death toll, while lower in direct violence, climbs into the thousands through hospital failures, heating system shutdowns, and infrastructure-dependent communities left without the basics of survival. Foreign adversaries don't fire a single bullet. They don't need to. They just watch and accelerate. Here is the thing that every single one of these scenarios has in common. None of them require a general to give an order. None of them require a formal declaration. They just require enough people on enough sides to decide that the system no longer deserves their cooperation. And that decision? It doesn't happen all at once. It happens one person at a time, one incident at a time, until one day you wake up and the country you thought you knew is unrecognizable. So what would the actual cost be? Let's talk numbers, because numbers make this real. Across the most credible modeling of a modern U.S. civil conflict, death estimates range from 10,000 in a cyber and economic war scenario to over 100,000 in a prolonged insurgency. And critically, the majority of those deaths would not be soldiers. They would be civilians. People who died because a hospital lost power, because a supply chain broke, because food stopped arriving in a city that couldn't feed itself. Syria is the modern reference point that analysts return to again and again. Syria's civil war, which began in 2011 as a series of protests that the government violently suppressed, produced 500,000 dead and 13 million displaced out of a country of 22 million people. In an American conflict, proportional displacement could push 5 to 10 million people out of their cities, overwhelming every border community in Canada and Mexico. The economic destruction would be generational. A 20 to 50% GDP collapse, depending on the scenario and duration, would erase between $5 and $10 trillion. The 2008 financial crisis cost approximately $10 trillion globally and took a decade to recover from. A domestic conflict of this scale would be categorically worse, because the institutions designed to manage economic crisis would themselves be compromised. And then there's the global consequence, the one Americans rarely think about. Because we've spent 80 years being the stable center of the world order, a United States consumed by internal conflict cannot maintain its military commitments abroad. NATO weakens. China moves on Taiwan. Russia tests the Baltic states. The global trading system, built on the assumption of American stability, fractures. Allies like Japan, South Korea, and the EU face economic shocks they are not prepared for. The end of American leadership doesn't just hurt Americans. It destabilizes a world that, for all its complaints about American power, has relied on it to keep the worst possibilities at bay. Here is the part of this conversation that most people skip, and they shouldn't. Civil wars are not inevitable. The conditions that produce them are real, and they are present in America today. But conditions are not destiny. Northern Ireland had 30 years of violence. Then it had the Good Friday Agreement, an imperfect, painful, painstakingly negotiated peace that held because enough people on enough sides decided that what they shared was more valuable than what divided them. America has something that most countries on the brink of civil war do not: a functional military that, however divided, has a deep institutional culture of constitutional loyalty. A federal judiciary that, however politicized, still commands broad procedural legitimacy. A civil society infrastructure, churches, community organizations, local governments that still functions in most of the country. These are not small things. These are the guardrails. But guardrails only work if people respect them. And respect for institutions, for the rules of democratic competition, for the idea that losing an election is not the same as losing your country, is not self-sustaining. It requires active maintenance. It requires political leaders who choose the system over their faction. It requires citizens who recognize that the person who voted differently than them is still a person, not an enemy. The research is unambiguous on one thing. Societies that find ways to maintain economic mobility, institutional trust, and cross-ideological civic engagement are dramatically less likely to slide into armed conflict than societies that don't. That means the prevention of a second civil war is not a government project. It is a culture project. And culture is built or destroyed one community at a time. So here is where we are. The conditions for a second American Civil War are more present today than at any point since Reconstruction. The triggers are real. The scenarios are plausible. The costs, in lives, in wealth, in global stability, would be catastrophic and generational. But this is not a story about inevitability. It is a story about a choice. Every generation of Americans has faced a version of this choice, between the fracture and the repair, between the easier path of treating political opponents as enemies and the harder path of treating them as countrymen with different views. The Americans who came before you chose the Republic, imperfectly, sometimes at enormous cost, over and over again. The question this generation has to answer is whether we still have what it takes to make the same choice. The answer to that question will define everything. If this video made you think, share it. Not because you agree with every word, but because these are conversations America needs to be having right now, while we still have the space to have them peacefully. Thank you for watching.